In 1989, the future of gaming fit right in your hands. A war was brewing, and two giants entered the handheld arena ready for a fight. First up was a technological marvel from Atari, the Lynx, boasting the world's very first color handheld screen and a 16-bit processor that could pull off graphical tricks worthy of a home console. Then came a powerhouse from Sega, the Game Gear, with a full-color, backlit display and a library of arcade hits. And then, there was this, a blurry, 4 shades of green screen, a processor that was already years out of date. By every technical measure, it was the weakest kid on the playground. It shouldn't have even survived the first round, let alone go on to dominate the market for over a decade. So how did this weak little handheld, the Nintendo Game Boy, go on to sell a combined total of over 118 million units with its successor, the Game Boy Color? This is the story of how Nintendo went to war with inferior technology. And won. It's a story that shows how they understood something their rivals didn't. Winning isn't always about having the most power. It's about having the right strategy. To understand the Game Boy, you have to understand the mind of its chief designer, Gunpei Yokoi. Long before the Game Boy, Yokoi was a legend at Nintendo. He'd created hits like Metroid and Kid Icarus, and was even a mentor to a young Shigeru Miyamoto. But his most important contribution wasn't a game, it was a philosophy. He called it Lateral Thinking with Withered Technology. The name might sound a little academic, but the idea is beautifully simple. Withered technology just means tech that's old, common, and cheap to produce. Lateral thinking means finding new and creative ways to use that old tech. Yokoi believed games didn't need to be on the cutting edge to be fun. In fact, he argued that chasing state-of-the-art tech was a trap. It led to expensive, unreliable products that were a nightmare to develop for. The real magic, he believed, came from taking simple, proven parts and using them in a way nobody had before. This wasn't a new idea for Nintendo. Yokoi had already proven his philosophy years earlier with the Game & Watch handhelds. Back then, companies like Sharp and Casio were in a price war over the calculator market, creating a surplus of cheap little LCD screens. While everyone else saw them as tools for math, Yokoi saw a platform for simple, addictive games. The result was a massive success that basically laid the groundwork for everything Nintendo would do in the portable space. The heart of Yokoi's philosophy was a deep focus on the player. He figured that as long as a game was fun to play, most people didn't actually care about bleeding-edge graphics. They cared about fun. They cared about a price that wouldn't break the bank. And for a portable system, they cared about something else even more. But to really appreciate what Nintendo pulled off, you have to see what they were up against. Because in the late 80s, two other titans of the industry were betting everything on the exact opposite idea. They believed more power and more colors were the only way to win. And they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. The first challenger was the Atari Lynx. Released in 1989, the Lynx was an absolute beast. It was the world's very first handheld with a color LCD screen. A stunning achievement for the time. But it didn't stop there. It had a powerful processor that allowed it to scale and rotate graphics, tricks that were usually reserved for beefy arcade machines. It even had a flippable screen for left-handed players. On paper, it was a revolution. Atari put it on shelves for $179.95. Then came Sega. Spurred on by Nintendo's success, Sega's CEO challenged his engineers to build a color handheld that would crush the competition. Rushed to market and released in 1990, The Sega Game Gear was essentially a portable version of their hit Master System home console. This gave it a huge head start with games. It boasted a backlit, full-color screen that could show 32 colors at once from a palette of over 4,000. Compared to the Game Boy's 4 shades of green, this was a generational leap. Sega launched it in North America for around $150. Both the Lynx and the Game Gear were incredible pieces of engineering. They were powerful, flashy, and made Nintendo's upcoming handheld look like a fossil before it even came out. Magazine ads and playground arguments all said the same thing. The future was in color. These machines were the Goliaths armed to the teeth with the latest tech. But their greatest strengths were also their greatest weaknesses. That beautiful color screen on the Lynx was incredibly power-hungry. It needed 6 AA batteries and would chew through them in about 4 to 5 hours. The Game Gear was even worse. Its bright, backlit screen also took 6 AAs, but would drain them in a brutal 3 to 5 hours. Sega even sold external battery packs to try and fix the problem, but they just made the whole setup more expensive and bulky. All that high-tech hardware also made the consoles pricey. The Lynx's $180 price tag was nearly double what the Game Boy would cost. The Game Gear was a bit more competitive at $150, but still a stretch for many families. And then there was the size. Both machines were massive, heavy bricks that stretched the very definition of portable. These weren't just little problems. They were fundamental flaws that a smaller, smarter competitor was perfectly positioned to exploit. When the Game Boy was finally revealed, the reaction was lukewarm at best. It launched in North America on July 31, 1989, for just $89.99. Its screen got most of the flack. A 160 by 144 pixel, non-backlit, dot matrix display that could only show 4 shades of a sickly greenish gray. Its processor was a custom 8-bit Sharp chip, a hybrid based on the Zilog Z80, which was a design that dated all the way back to the 1970s. Next to the Lynx, it was ancient. By every metric the industry cared about, the Game Boy was weak. But this wasn't an accident. It wasn't because Nintendo couldn't do better. Every single one of the Game Boy's weaknesses was a deliberate, strategic choice, born from Gunpei Yokoi's philosophy. Yokoi and his team had messed around with more advanced tech, including a color screen. But they realized the technology just wasn't ready. It cost too much and, most importantly, it was a battery vampire. Yokoi understood the core truth of a handheld device. Its main job is to be portable. And what good is a portable console if you can't take it far from a wall outlet? So they made a calculated trade-off. They chose that withered monochrome screen and that older processor for 2 very specific reasons. The first was price. By using cheap, reliable, off-the-shelf parts, Nintendo could sell the Game Boy for just $89.99, a price that made it an easy choice for the average family. While its rivals were premium electronics, the Game Boy was positioned as an affordable toy. The second and most important reason was battery life. While the Lynx and Game Gear died in a few hours, the Game Boy could run for an astonishing 15 to 30 hours on just 4 AA batteries. This wasn't just a small advantage, it was the whole ballgame. It meant the Game Boy could survive long car rides, flights, and entire weekends away from home. It fulfilled the core promise of being truly portable, a problem its competitors, in their race for raw power, had completely ignored. Finally, there was durability. Yokoi designed the Game Boy to be a tank. Its chunky plastic shell was built to survive the chaos of a kid's backpack. It was a nearly indestructible brick that just kept working drop after drop. This reliability, combined with its low price and legendary battery life, formed the 3 pillars of its strategy. Nintendo wasn't trying to build the most powerful handheld. It was trying to build the most practical one. And that made all the difference. A console is nothing without games. And Nintendo had an ace up its sleeve that was just as important as the hardware. For the North American and European launch, every single Game Boy was bundled with a copy of a puzzle game from a Soviet software engineer named Alexei Pajitnov. That game was Tetris. Now, the story of how Nintendo got the handheld rights to Tetris is a whole spy thriller in itself, but the result was a perfect marriage of hardware and software. Tetris was the Game Boy's killer app. A piece of software so good that it could sell the hardware all by itself. First, its simple design was a perfect match for the Game Boy's monochrome screen. Tetris didn't need flashy colors. The block shapes were clear, and the gameplay was instantly understandable, turning the screen's biggest perceived weakness into a total non-issue. Second, the gameplay was perfect for a portable device. You could play Tetris for 5 minutes while waiting for the bus, or for hours on a rainy afternoon. This pick-up-and-play style helped define a whole new kind of mobile gaming. Third, and maybe most importantly, Tetris was for everyone. Unlike the action games aimed at hardcore gamers on the Lynx and Game Gear, Tetris crossed every demographic. Kids loved it, parents loved it, even grandparents got hooked. Nintendo's marketing brilliantly capitalized on this. By 1995, Nintendo of America reported that 46% of Game Boy players were female, a much higher number than for their home consoles. Tetris was the key that unlocked this massive audience. It wasn't a game for gamers, it was a game for people. Bundling Tetris with the console was a masterstroke. It meant every person who bought a Game Boy had an amazing, endlessly replayable game right out of the box. The game went on to sell over 35 million copies on the platform, a testament to its addictive power. The success of the Game Boy can't be separated from the success of Tetris. They were two halves of a single, perfect product. When the battle for the handheld market kicked off in the holiday season of 1989, it was David versus two Goliaths. On one side, powerful, pricey, color screen machines. On the other, an affordable, durable, monochrome underdog. The market's decision was swift and brutal. In the United States, the Game Boy launched on July 31st, 1989, and sold 40,000 units on its first day alone. Within weeks, that number hit 1 million. While the Lynx and Game Gear appealed to a niche of tech enthusiasts, the Game Boy's low price and the universal appeal of Tetris made it a mainstream phenomenon. Sega's Game Gear, for all its technical might, never caught up. It sold a respectable 10.62 million units in its lifetime, but that was a drop in the bucket compared to Nintendo. The Atari Lynx fared even worse, selling fewer than 7 million units. Meanwhile, by 1997, the original Game Boy and its redesigns had already sold over 64 million units worldwide. But Nintendo didn't stop there. In 1996, they released the Game Boy Pocket, a smaller, lighter version that ran on 2 AAA batteries for about 10 hours. Crucially, it had an improved screen, a true black and white display that was far clearer than the original's pea soup green. It played all the same games and perfectly coincided with the arrival of a new cultural juggernaut, Pokémon. The release of Pokémon Red and Blue in North America in 1998 gave the aging Game Boy a massive second wind, driving sales through the roof. That same year, Nintendo finally released the Game Boy Color. But it was still a modest upgrade, featuring a color screen without a power-hungry backlight. Most importantly, it was backward compatible with the entire library of original Game Boy games. This meant the huge existing library of titles wasn't suddenly obsolete. The combined sales of the entire Game Boy family eventually hit a staggering 118.69 million units. The story of the Game Boy is a masterclass in strategy, and it's a philosophy Nintendo still follows. If you want to see how these exact same ideas led to another one of Nintendo's huge underdog wins, check out our video on how the Nintendo Wii took over the world. And if you enjoy these deep dives into gaming history, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. So how did Nintendo win with weak technology? The secret is the technology was never the point. The Atari Lynx and Sega Game Gear were pieces of tech. The Nintendo Game Boy was a product. Gunpei Yokoi didn't set out to build the most powerful handheld. He set out to build the best portable gaming experience. He understood that for a handheld, best didn't mean the most polygons or colors. It meant being affordable enough for a kid to save up for. It meant being durable enough to survive being dropped. It meant having a battery that could last an entire family road trip. And it meant having a library of games, led by a killer app like Tetris, that were fun for absolutely everyone. The competition was so focused on winning the spec war, they lost sight of the user. They built powerful machines that created a frustrating experience, tethering players to power outlets and draining their wallets. Nintendo focused on the player first and made deliberate technological sacrifices to serve their needs. This philosophy, lateral thinking with withered technology, is in Nintendo's DNA. You can see it in the simple motion controls of the Wii. You can see it in the dual screens of the Nintendo DS. And you can see it today in the Nintendo Switch, a console that's less powerful than its rivals but offers a unique, flexible experience that has made it a global sensation. The Game Boy's victory is one of the most important stories in the history of tech. It's proof that innovation isn't just about raw power. It's about creative thinking, understanding your audience, and delivering a complete, thoughtful experience. Proved that sometimes the smartest way to win isn't to bring the biggest weapon to the fight. It's to change the rules of the battle itself.